There is indeed a conspiracy of silence about Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, and not just the critics that hated it. I think the government really had reasons to want this film not to be shown.
Today, the battle rages over bioengineered foods. But back in the 1970s, the practice was in its infancy. Of those who knew the hidden dangers, few were willing to risk their lives to expose the truth.
When you've got the CIA and KGB and all these people always looking over your shoulder, you had to be careful. And it's tough to be creative when you're, frankly, and I'm not ashamed to say it, scared.
God, who would have thought? All we wanted was a bigger, healthier tomato.
It's funny that Killer Tomatoes may have been the clarion call for the human race to realize that our way of life is being changed by these frankenfoods and biogenetics and these kind of things. And 25 years ago, we were the first people to point out this potentially growing menace. And now you see people protesting all over the world. Nobody was protesting in 1978.
Well, certainly the world is a lot more aware of the risk we face from vegetables. Previous to Killer Tomatoes, I think people thought of them as benign or as just food.
We were the fellows with a crystal ball that sort of saw this before it happened.
Well, we've been eating them for years, but you notice there's always more. If you go to the grocery store, there's still more. It doesn't matter how many vegetables you buy, the next day you go in, there's more vegetables. It's as though they're growing right out of the ground.
If we don't step in and preemptively deal with the tomatoes, then we can just assume that the rest of the fruit and vegetable world will eventually move on us, just as the killer tomatoes have in their own nefarious and dark ways. So the key is vigilance.
Eat your vegetables before they eat you.
Technically, sir, tomatoes are fags.
He means fruits.
There's a mere technical difference there.
It's not an accident that many fruits are mistaken for vegetables and vice versa. Fruits and vegetables have cohabitated and plotted amongst each other for many centuries in a cross-species effort in order to accomplish world domination.
People say killer tomato syndrome, they mean frankenfoods. It's just another term. And how did I know? I'm not at liberty to discuss that.
Tráilers. Visita mi canal.
I remember one day right out of high school, I was talking to Costa Dillon. He said, you know, it would be funny to make a movie where maybe a tomato comes out of a sink and it eats a housewife. We could call it Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. And he said the title, and I thought it was just drop-dead funny. And I said, maybe someday we can actually make that movie. And we did. Attack of the Killer Tomatoes began as a title and became a movie.
Attack of the Killer Tomatoes.
It's the funniest title ever made. It's got to be in the top 10 funny titles of all time.
The Attack of the Killer Tomatoes.
We thought just the title would let people know that this was a crazy comedy.
Yeah. That'll probably become like the Rocky, the horror show, you know, be a cult thing.
This is art.
Mom, did you hear that? Well, the first thing you have to realize is Attack of the Killer Tomatoes has absolutely no socially redeeming value whatsoever.
John said, I want to make the most egregious trash I can make because based on my research, that's what sells.
Attack of the Killer Tomatoes was a takeoff on all the gloriously horrible 1950s Japanese horror movies.
What we have developed is, in essence, a half-man, half-robot.
A lot of people had never seen those Japanese movies, so when Attack of the Killer Tomatoes came out, they didn't know what to think. We were doing this a year or two before Airplane. That kind of humor wasn't out yet, so to do non sequitur comedy with a lot of really stupid gags with an incredibly stupid premise was sort of beyond the mindset of a lot of people.
I can't say it was designed to be bad. I think some things are just serendipity. You set out to be the best you can be, and if the best you can be is the worst you can be, that's okay.
Was recently named as one of the 25 worst films ever made.
So, yeah, we worked real hard at being bad. In fact, I recall we actually had some trouble in some of the film festival issues that were built around bad movies because we'd be disqualified because, after all, we were being bad on purpose.
I'm greatly honored by the fact that Somebody had to be the worst vegetable movie. Why couldn't it be us? And indeed, it is.
To be amongst the worst films, or amongst the worst vegetable films, would have been a tremendous disappointment. But to actually get to the pinnacle of worst was certainly very satisfying.
I think that people have set out to make bad movies long before then. I don't subscribe to the theory that nobody sets out to make a bad movie. No, no, no.
When you make your first movie, one of the most important things is to read the reviews. And I remember Kevin Thomas in the Los Angeles Times. The Los Angeles Times, the newspaper of Los Angeles and Hollywood, his review was about that big.
It was terrifically dismissive. That part I do remember.
The funny thing about the review was he said the movie was hopelessly inane.
I hadn't, of course, remembered that.
Bingo, that's exactly what the movie is, hopelessly inane. So we took Kevin Thomas's review and we splattered that word, that phrase, hopelessly inane, across our one-sheets and our posters.
Oh, I'm a great believer in honesty in advertising.
And it may be the only time in the history of movie criticism, certainly in the only time in the history of Kevin Thomas, that what was meant to be a bad review became not only a good review, but the review for what later became a cult classic.
I think the best description amongst all the critics when Killer Tomatoes came out was actually when it was released in Los Angeles, and it was, I think it was KTLA Channel 5, referred to it as in an era where filmmakers take themselves oh so seriously, the makers of Attack the Killer Tomatoes appear to be just trying to have fun.
My agent called me and they said, it's not a big picture or anything, but Jack, it's $1,000. Nobody will ever hear about this. Well, the next morning it was on the Today Show. Actor almost dies in crash, you know. Got gigantic publicity out of it.
I am Mrs. Williams, and I did that role in the first 3 films. And she was a widow lady, and her husband was killed by a great tomato.
Across this great nation, almost everyone has been affected in one way or another by this terrible tomato onslaught.
The auditions were in a garage at a house, and Barbara Muir had helped with the casting, and she had called me, and she said, "Can you scream?" And I go, "Well, of course. I mean, anybody can scream." "No, I mean really scream, because John's looking for screamers."
A lot of actresses I've worked with have often said after the fact that their audition with me, there was a lot of screaming.
The minute I hit the room, before I handed the resume and photo to John, I just started screaming. He just kind of sat there. Okay, next. And I went, oh, I shouldn't have taken the chance. And, a couple days later, I get a call, "You've got the part." And I went, oh my God, this is so great.
Do you think he's dead? Well, Will you miss him? Will you marry again? What if he's laying in a ditch somewhere, with both his legs calling your name?
Sometimes you do a movie and you see a scene in your mind, and it comes out that way, not very often. This was one of the ones that came out as good or better than I'd hoped it would. And if there's any particular scene I would say to watch in Attack the Killer Tomatoes, it's DJ's scene.
I'm not sure whether the Tomatoes ever interrelated with other actors in the same way they did with me or with John or with Costa.
The Royal Shakespearean tomatoes were great because they're professionals, and they were never a problem. I think the problem came when we used the amateurs.
We had a cattle call for tomatoes initially. We had thousands of tomatoes interested in being in this movie. Some were splatters, some just sort of sat there, but the ones that could roll and roll over people and right through people, they had a pretty good shot of making it into the movie, and as you saw, many of them did.
I was up at the Beechwood Cafe in LA, and a man came up behind me and sat a tomato in the middle of my hamburger and French fries. And I turned around, and he was just grinning ear from ear, and he goes, "Don't tell me you're not the tomato lady." And I said, "Well, yes, I am." And he said, "Would you sign it?" And I said, "This is a real tomato." "Well, I have a felt pen here, and I want you to sign it, Mrs. Williams." So that was really strange, and my friends and I are going, okay, and they handed me the pen, and I signed Mrs. Williams' Attack of the Killer Tomato on this tomato that was about this big.
I still get letters, and somebody sent me a little Attack of the Killer Tomatoes watch souvenir, which was nice.
The first time I saw Attack of the Killer Tomatoes was about in 1983. I had joined the U.S. Navy out of high school, and what we would do as a crew is watch videos. And a lot of that video time was spent watching Attack of the Killer Tomatoes over and over and over again. It was a bunch of great guys sitting around watching a great movie on the front lines of the Cold War.
It's the inspiration for every film that's been made, I think, with the exception of Schindler's List, although there was a bit of Killer Tomato in there with the girl with the red coat.
I've never really looked at other films from their standpoint. I certainly noticed that a lot of films have stolen ideas from Killer Tomatoes.
The most obvious example that everybody points to, of course, is Airplane, or as John DeBell referred to as Killer Tomatoes with a budget.
The ending of Mars Attacks is clearly they try to replicate the success of the puberty love ending of Killer Tomatoes.
But when you see something as excellent as Killer Tomatoes, you want to reward it. Unfortunately, the Academy didn't quite see it the way I did.
Looking forward from Killer Tomatoes to present day, you see a lot of movies out there that have won Oscars. I would say, without an exception, except maybe Bowling for Columbine, Killer Tomatoes was the inspiration for those movies.
Quitus tráilers.
The stupidest thing that actually ever happened.
I don't remember.
There were many stupid things that happened during the filming of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. As a movie with that name should have happened, there was the helicopter crash, which was not particularly brilliant, but it was beautiful, and it really helped make the movie. The other thing that I think was really stupid was the fact that we built a really cool miniaturization set that we used in our big climatic battle scene, and it had a big lake full of water in this big miniature set that was about the size of a large room. And the guy doing the work on it, just before we started filming, decided he was going to test the quality of the explosions that he could do in the water, and he threw in a cherry bomb that was a bit too big. And he blew out the bottom of the set, and the water went all over the studio, and that was not a pretty sight.
I would say the stupidest thing that happened is that we chose Costa Dillon to be the driver in the scene when I was being dragged behind a car.
Oh, well, it depends on whether you define that as stupid or not.
Steve was gutsy in this movie. Steve Peace did his own stunts, and he did some really physical work.
And yes, we devised that stunt, storyboarded it extensively on 3x5 cards. And when we were towing Steve behind the car, we didn't have a mechanism for letting go.
It was on a belly board that you would use to work on a car.
Concept was the same as if somebody's water skiing. So if you whip around a corner, just like a water skier whips around the boat.
As I'm whipped around the corner, we see that our crack crew had allegedly made sure everything was safe on the street, had failed to note that a car was parked along the side of the road.
And when you're 3 inches off the ground on this little platform being dragged, you can run into things.
And I'm screaming at the top of my lungs, "Stop, stop, stop the car." And suddenly it occurred to me that Costa was driving, and of course Costa's deaf in his left ear.
I went this way, and Steve went that way, and the car parked over here with the transaxle was parked that way.
And I can see that I'm going to run right into this car on the belly board.
Steve met the differential on the rear end of this car.
Wham! Right into the car, right under one of the cars on the side of the road.
Cracking the goggles, breaking the glass out of them.
And just like the helicopter crash that occurred later, it was like, oh my God, one of the actors is dead. And it's worse because he's a writer-producer.
Steve's head survived, I believe. I think after 20 years in the California legislature, many people will probably look back on that incident and draw their own conclusions. I also drove the car that hit David Miller at the end of the movie after the chase, and being that I was hunkered down behind the steering wheel and people were yelling at me, 8 feet, 6 feet, 5 feet, 4 feet, it's a wonder I didn't kill him because I had to stop right where he was. Since then, we've figured out that filmmakers do that by having the person fall down and move the car backwards and run the film the other way. What do you know? What a concept. We like to live on the edge, and so we did it the regular way.
Move it on.
We made Killer Tomatoes in college as a Super 8 film. Then a couple of years later, we went out and started an aborted version of a 16mm film before we made the epic Killer Tomatoes on 35mm. I'm thinking the sequel should be an IMAX movie.
You think we write scripts before we shoot these things?
We're thinking the next Attack of the Killer Tomatoes should be called Attack of the Killer Tomatoes Genetically Incorrect.
Obviously, our dream cast would be Red Skelton, Red Buttons, Vanessa Redgrave, Robert Redford, but I'm not sure they're all available while some of them have passed on.
Based on our early projections, we think the budget of the next Attack of the Killer Tomatoes movie is going to be around $145 million. Most of that's above the line for producers' fees. We still have about $183 left for the actual filming.
No, that's an art. The first film had a budget of $7 or $8 million, if I remember right, and we maintained that low budget look then.
From the producer's perspective, our goal, of course, is very simple. It's to get a film that makes a whole lot of money and which we spend no money on.
It seems to me that whatever happens with Killer Tomatoes, our loyal fan base will want to follow their intrepid adventures because, I mean, after you've watched a Killer Tomato movie, what else is there?
Kid, you always got to go with an open mind and hope for the best.
Tráilers. Visita mi canal.
Move it on.
Well, it's got to be one of the greatest thrills of my personal life. It's not everyone can say that they were in what was considered one of the worst movies in the history of Hollywood, but I keep it as a badge of honor and very close to me. I'll tell you, at least being in the big climactic scene, the stomping of the tomatoes, what made me nervous is that I could stomp on as many tomatoes as possible, running up that large rampway of the exit at the stadium, and as these tomatoes were rolling down, I was a little concerned that, well, stomping these tomatoes, you know, the squishiness and the juice would get all over my leotards. It's really a pain getting tomato stains and tomato paste out of leotards, but I came to the conclusion, anything for art. I tell you, it brings back very fond memories. It was an important point, and I think it helped launch my career into superstardom for a chicken.
There's a special place in my heart for the San Diego Chicken. I think we helped create his persona. I noticed after he did Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, where he was in the stadium crowd, he spent the next 25 years hanging out at stadiums. So I gotta believe Attack of the Killer Tomatoes had a lot to do with his career.
John is a perfectionist, he's meticulous, but he didn't mind the tomato stains on my leotards. He thought that added more to the ambience of the scene. Very, very important because it brought feeling, it brought emotion, it meant destruction. I remember him calling the entire troop together and saying, "Look at those tomato stains on the chicken's legs. Look at those. You've got to be mad about it because they're trying to fight back. They're trying to cut us from the knees down." And so it kind of like inspired the entire troop, I felt. I tell you, for my money, John deserved the Academy Award.
As far as working with chickens, he is definitely one of the finest chickens I have ever worked with.
What?